Life has a funny way of bringing people together and tearing them apart. Some relationships are built on love and trust, while others are poisoned by selfishness and resentment. My story isn't just about a broken family. It's about sacrifice, responsibility, and the consequences of neglect. My name is Laura. I'm 48 years old now, but this story takes place over the last 2 decades. My younger sister Diana is 46, but we were never really close. Even as kids, she was always distant, selfish, and entitled. She believed the world owed her something just for existing. Our parents, bless their hearts, did what they could to raise us, but Diana never cared much for rules or responsibilities. When we finished high school, we went in completely different directions. I focused on my education, working hard to build a stable life. Diana, on the other hand, jumped into a relationship with a rich boyfriend and lived off his money. At the time, I thought she was lucky. After all, she never had to struggle like I did. But as I would soon learn, easy beginnings often lead to hard endings. By the time Diana was 21, she had 3 kids, twin girls and a baby boy. Our parents were worried, but Diana brushed off their concerns. She was convinced that her boyfriend would take care of her forever. But forever didn't last long. She found out he had been cheating on her, and just like that, her comfortable life collapsed. I paid child support but wanted nothing to do with the kids. And suddenly, for the first time in her life, Diana had to take care of herself and 3 little lives who depended on her. I didn't like Diana, but I wasn't heartless. Those kids had no one else. So despite our rocky relationship, I helped when I could. I had a stable job, but I wasn't rich, so I gave what little I could. Our parents chipped in too. It was never enough to make Diana comfortable again, but at least she and the kids weren't starving. At first, I believed she would adjust. She would grow into the role of a responsible mother. But instead, Diana grew resentful. She saw her kids not as blessings, but as burdens. They were the reason she couldn't chase her dreams, the reason men left her, the reason she had to work long hours, and worst of all, she made sure they knew it. Raising children is never easy, but raising children when you don't want them? That's a disaster waiting to happen. Diana struggled. She had no degree, no work experience, and no patience. She jumped between jobs that paid minimum wage, complaining, every step of the way. She blamed everyone but herself, her ex, our parents, and even me. But the worst of it, she blamed her kids. Since hiring a babysitter was too expensive, she relied on me. Almost every night I would get a call. Laura, can you watch the kids? I have to work late. Laura, I have a date. Can you come over? Laura, the kids are driving me crazy. Just take them for a few hours. At first I didn't mind. I loved my nieces and nephew. But over time, I realized she wasn't just asking for help. She was dumping them on me. Diana never took responsibility for their lives. If she wasn't working, she was out with men, chasing the love she thought she deserved. And when things didn't work out, she blamed the kids. No man wants a woman with 3 kids. I gave up everything for you. I should have left you with your father. Can you imagine being a child and hearing that from your own mother? I tried to talk to her, but she didn't care. You don't get it, Laura. You don't have kids. You don't know how hard it is. But I did. I knew because I was the one actually raising them. I was the one who helped them with homework. I was the one who comforted them when they were scared. I was the one who showed up when they needed someone, Diana. She was just a stranger living in the same house. The years passed, and the kids grew up knowing one thing. Their mother didn't love them. She wasn't physically abusive, but emotional scars last just as long, if not longer. She would scream at them over nothing. If they laughed too loud, if they made a mess, if they asked for anything. She reminded them daily that they ruined her life, and then there were the men. Diana cycled through boyfriends, each one worse than the last, and with every new relationship, she would lie. She Wouldn't mention her kids until months into dating, and then, when the guy left, she would lash out at them. "You're the reason I'm alone. You ruined my life. No one wants a woman with baggage." One night my niece called me crying. She was 12. "Aunt Laura, Mom said she's going to leave us. She said she doesn't want to be our mom anymore." I was furious. I drove over that night and confronted Diana. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I demanded. She just rolled her eyes. "They're just being dramatic. They know I don't mean it." But she did. She meant every word. I wanted to take them away. I wanted to give them a real home. But legally, I couldn't. Diana wasn't breaking any laws. She wasn't hitting them. She wasn't starving them. She was just neglecting them. And for years, I had to stand by and watch. Time has a way of opening our eyes to the truth. For my nieces and nephew, that truth became undeniable as they grew older. By the time they were teenagers, they had already experienced more pain and neglect than most children ever should. They weren't allowed to be kids. There was no warmth, no affection, no encouragement, only blame, bitterness, and endless reminders that they were unwanted. I saw it in their eyes every time I visited. The way they hesitated before speaking, the way they flinched at their mother's tone, the way they seemed older than they should be, carrying the weight of a mother who never wanted them in the first place. They wanted to leave. They had wanted to leave for years. But until they turned 18, they were trapped, and Diana knew it. She wasn't afraid of losing them because, in her mind, they weren't capable of leaving. They needed her. Or rather, they needed the roof she provided. "You think you're going anywhere?" She sneered one night when my nephew, then 17, brought up college. "Good luck surviving on your own. You'll come crawling back to me just like your father should have." He didn't respond, but I saw the way his fists clenched under the table. He wasn't angry. He was determined. That was the night I knew for sure. When the time came, they would leave, and they would never look back. It wasn't an impulsive decision. They had been planning it for years, saving whatever little money they could, figuring out where they would go and how they would survive. They never told their mother, of course. If she had known, she would have tried to sabotage them. She would have guilt-tripped them, threatened them, or worse, made their last few months under her roof unbearable. But they told me. One night, my nephew called me. His voice was steady, but I could hear the weight of his words. "Aunt Laura, we need to talk." They were counting down the days until their 18th birthdays, ready to leave the moment they legally could. My home was their only safe option. They had nowhere else to go. And of course I said yes. I didn't have to think twice. I had been there for them their whole lives. I had watched them suffer under Diana's neglect. And if I could give them a chance at freedom, I would do it in a heartbeat. "I'll be waiting for you," I promised. That last year before they turned 18 was the hardest. Diana became even more unbearable, snapping at them over every little thing. "You're just like your father, useless. If I didn't have you, I'd be living my best life. I should have put you up for adoption when I had the chance." They never answered back. They had learned it was pointless. Instead, they focused on their goal: escape. I did everything I could to support them from the sidelines. I helped my nephew apply for college, scholarships. I worked with my niece to get her first job so she could start saving for her future. And the other twin? She had a talent for hairstyling, so I bought her her first set of professional scissors and brushes, knowing she would use them to build something better for herself. But the hardest part? Keeping their spirits up. One night, my youngest niece broke down. "Aunt Laura, what if we never get out? What if we end up like her?" Her voice was shaking. She was terrified, not of her mother, but of turning into her. I pulled her into a hug. "Listen to me," I said firmly. "You are nothing like her. You are kind. You are strong. You love people. And that is why you will never be like her." She nodded, but I could tell she was still afraid. And in that moment, I hated Diana more than I ever had before. Because no child should ever feel like they have to fight against their own blood just to survive. The day finally came. They didn't make a scene. There was no dramatic goodbye, no screaming match. They simply packed their things and walked out the door. Diana didn't even realize they were leaving for good. She was too busy with her latest boyfriend, lounging on the couch with a glass of wine. "Where are you going?" she asked absent-mindedly when she saw them carrying bags. "Out," my niece replied. Diana shrugged and went back to her conversation, laughing at something her boyfriend said. She didn't even look at them as they left. She had no idea they weren't coming back. That night when they arrived at my house, I expected them to be relieved, happy even. But instead, they just sat there, silent. They weren't crying. They weren't celebrating. They just looked exhausted. I set out food for them, but they barely touched it. "You're safe now," I told them gently. "You don't have to worry anymore." But they just nodded, their faces blank. Years of emotional neglect don't just disappear overnight. They were free, yes, but they were also broken. It wasn't until the next morning that Diana realized what had happened. She called my phone, furious. "Where the hell are my kids?" she screamed the moment I answered. "They're here," I said simply. She laughed, like it was some kind of joke. "Yeah, right. Tell them to get their asses home." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Diana, they're not coming back." Silence. Then an explosion of rage. "What the fuck do you mean they're not coming back? I raised them. I sacrificed for them. I wasted 18 years of my life for them, and this is how they repay me?" For the first time in my life, I didn't hold back. "You didn't raise them, Diana. You neglected them. You treated them like burdens. You made them feel like they ruined your life. And now you're surprised that they don't want to stay with you?" She went quiet again. But not because she was reflecting. No, she was thinking of her next move, and I knew exactly what it would be. "They'll come back," she muttered. "They'll realize how hard life is, and when they do, they'll come crawling back." She hung up before I could respond. I sighed. I knew she was wrong. These kids had spent their whole lives surviving in a home that never felt like home. They weren't coming back. Not now. Not ever. For the next few years, my home was their home. But in reality, they weren't there much. They were busy carving out their own futures, something their mother never helped them with. My nephew worked tirelessly to get into medical school. My nieces pursued their passions, one in literature, the other in beauty and hairstyling. They didn't just escape Diana's house. They built something better for themselves. And me? I was just happy to be there for them. I never asked for anything in return. I didn't need gratitude. I didn't need a thank you. All I needed was to see them happy. But what happened years later took me by surprise. Because those kids, now adults, weren't just grateful. They wanted to give back in a way I never expected. And when Diana found out, well, let's just say the real drama was only beginning. Freedom doesn't always come easy. Just because my nieces and nephew had finally escaped their mother's toxic grasp didn't mean life was suddenly smooth sailing for them. For the first time, they were out in the real world, fully responsible for themselves. And even though they were relieved to be away from Diana, there was still a lingering shadow of everything they had endured. Years of emotional neglect don't just vanish overnight. The first few months were the hardest. They were adjusting to a life where they didn't have to walk on eggshells, where they didn't have to fear their own home. But that kind of trauma stays with you. I could see it in small ways. How my nephew hesitated before asking for help, as if expecting to be scolded. How my nieces apologized too much, even when they hadn't done anything wrong. How they kept waiting for something to go wrong. As if happiness was something temporary, something they weren't allowed to have. It broke my heart. So I did what I had always done. I made sure they knew they were safe. I reassured them, supported them, and reminded them that they had a future worth fighting for. And let me tell you, these kids, they didn't just survive, they thrived. The first step was helping them find their footing. My nephew had always been brilliant. Even as a child, he would talk about wanting to become a doctor, something Diana never encouraged. But I did. With his intelligence and work ethic, he had earned scholarships to medical school. But getting in was one thing. Surviving was another. He worked part-time jobs to support himself, barely sleeping, studying for hours on end. I helped where I could, covering some of his living expenses so he could focus on school. There were nights when he doubted himself. "Aunt Laura, what if I'm not good enough?" he admitted one evening, exhausted from an exam. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "You are more than good enough. You've made it this far despite everything. That doesn't just happen by accident." And he believed me. Years later, after endless studying, sleepless nights, and sheer determination, he became a pediatrician, a doctor dedicated to helping children. Maybe because deep down, he knew what it was like to feel lost and unheard. I had never been prouder. My first niece had always been a dreamer. She loved stories, books, and writing. But Diana constantly dismissed her passion. "You think you're going to make a living off books? Grow up!" But she didn't give up. She worked her way through college, studying literature, determined to prove to herself that her dreams were worth chasing. And she did. She became a teacher. But not just any teacher. One of those teachers that change lives. The kind who sees the kids struggling silently in the back of the classroom and makes sure they know they matter, because she knew what it was like to feel invisible. And then there was the other twin, the more rebellious one. She never cared much for academics, but she had a gift, a real talent for hairstyling. She could transform someone's entire appearance with just a pair of scissors and a vision in her mind. Diana, of course, mocked her for it. "You think cutting hair is a real career? You'll never make it." But she proved her wrong. She saved up, took business classes, and eventually opened her own hair salon. And not just any salon, a thriving business with loyal customers and a waiting list for appointments. She made something out of nothing, and she did it all without her mother's support. By the time they were all financially stable, it had been about 7 years since they had left Diana's house. 7 years since they had started over, built their own futures, and finally become the people they were always meant to be. And, through it all, I had never once asked for anything in return. I helped them because I loved them, because someone had to, because no one else did. I never expected anything back. But they had other plans. It was my 48th birthday when it happened. My nephew had organized a small gathering, just close family and friends. I wasn't expecting much, just a nice evening. Together. But toward the end of the night, the three of them sat me down, their faces more serious than usual. "Aunt Laura," my nephew started, "we need to talk." For a split second, my heart dropped. I thought something was wrong. But then my niece pulled out an envelope and handed it to me. "This is for you." Confused, I opened it, and inside was a check, a substantial one. I stared at it, stunned. What is this?" My other niece smiled, eyes glistening with emotion. "It's our way of saying thank you." I shook my head. No, I can't accept this. "I never helped you for money." "We know," my nephew interrupted gently. "This isn't about money. This is about everything you did for us. The love, the support, the belief in us when no one else had it. We will never be able to repay you for that. But please, let us do this." I felt my throat tighten. I had never cried in front of them before, but that night I did. Because for the first time in my life, I realized something. I hadn't just been their aunt. I had been their mother in every way that counted, and they knew it. I hadn't spoken to Diana in years. I figured she had moved on, forgotten about them the way she had always wanted to, but then I made a mistake. I posted about their gift online, not to brag, but to express my gratitude. To show the world how proud I was of them. And somehow Diana saw it. A few days later, she sent me a message. "We need to talk." I almost ignored it. But curiosity got the best of me. And when I opened the message, I nearly laughed. She wanted to reconnect with her kids. After all these years, after never reaching out, after never once asking how they were, now that she knew they were successful, she suddenly wanted a relationship? I didn't respond, so she called me instead. "Laura, listen, I know I made mistakes. But they're still my kids. I deserve a second chance," I scoffed. "You didn't even care about them when they lived with you. Now you suddenly care? Or is it because you realize they have money?" She gasped. "How dare you?" "No, Diana, how dare you? You abandoned them. You treated them like they ruined your life. And now that they've built something for themselves, you think you're entitled to a piece of it? They don't owe you anything. She lost it. You stole them from me. You stole my children, and now you're stealing what's mine." I laughed coldly. "You lost them all on your own." I hung up, and just like that, she was out of our lives again. This time. For good. Diana could scream all she wanted. She could play the victim, twist the story, pretend she cared. But the truth? Her children had chosen their real family, and it wasn't her. I didn't need their money. I didn't need recognition, but I did need this. Knowing that, in the end, love wins. And despite everything, we had won. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe. Life has a funny way of teaching lessons, and sometimes the most unexpected endings are the most satisfying.